surrender it to the man you've come to listen to, Steve Wheeler. Steve Wheeler is a man who's just left Plymouth University in the UK after 20 years in academia. Now he's out in the wild world, and goodness me, he's traveling like a madman. He does more international keynotes than anybody else I know. He was recently in Korea for 12 hours, flew from the UK to Korea, had a shower, had a shave, did a keynote on international TV, and then flew back to the UK. That's how much he travels. He describes himself as being at the nexus of technology and psychology. If we think about that, of course, that means learning technology. So he's the perfect guy to have here. Plus, he's got a great background, and he's thought about this a lot. Over 100 articles, 5 books, and he's a great popular speaker at learning technologies. He's spoken in London many years on the trot. He'll be back again in January, and it's my privilege to welcome him here to the stage in Singapore. Ladies and gentlemen, please give it up for our keynote for the second day, Steve Wheeler.
Thank you, Don. Oh, thank you. It's a great introduction there. And thank you all for being here this morning. And thank you, Don and the team, for inviting me to come to Singapore for this inaugural event. It's good fun, isn't it? You enjoying yourselves? Yeah? Some of you are. Most of you, who's this bloke? But it's fun because this is about my 4th visit to Singapore this year, actually. And first time I came, I got into a bit of trouble, as you do, because I blame it on the check-in clerk myself, the woman at Heathrow Airport. I blame it on her, because when I checked my bags in, first time out to Singapore, this time last year, to speak at the Adult Learning Symposium in this very building, she looked at me and she looked at my passport and she said, "Oh, you're going to Singapore, right?" And so she stuck a sticker on my bag and it said S-I-N. You know what's going to happen next. And so, it was I was about 24 hours into my visit here before I realized it wasn't an instruction. All right? So we live and learn, don't we? But anyway, what I'm here today to do is to give you a bit of a kind of an insight into my own thinking about what I think the future is going to hold for us in learning and development, in education as a whole, actually, not just in your domain, but also in schools and universities. The whole idea, the whole continuum, if you like, of where we go from when we're born and when we go through school and when we go through our college or university or our training and we eventually enter into the world of work. It's a big continuum. We need to think of it like that. So a few disclaimers. Firstly, I'm not going to mention certain things today. I'm not going to mention learner analytics because other people have done it much better than me. There's a guy down there, for instance. And I'm not going to mention things like blockchain, which Ger goes, well, maybe you can come up later on and you can talk about blockchain. But I'm not an expert in that area. Go and look at people like Don Tapscott, look at his work, because those are the real experts. I'm also not going to be very specific about things like HoloLens. But I will mention some specific things that are happening in the next week or two, which I think will thrill you. There are other disclaimers as well. The thing is, when you start talking about the future, it's very, very difficult because it hasn't happened yet, right? And that means that we can be very, very wrong. I'll give you some examples in a moment, how people have got it really wrong. But you can get it right by accident. The best way to predict the future, as someone once said, is to create it yourselves. But there's a reliable way that you can look at, where you can look at previous trajectories and see where they're going. And this is what I'm going to try and do today with you. Look at some previous things that have happened, and then look at some existing technologies, and then maybe look at some of the more exotic ones, and some of the ones that you might find a little bit scary or challenging in some way. And here's the first slide for you. This is Michio Kaku, who says exactly the same thing I've just said. It's almost impossible to predict the future with great accuracy. I think you can start talking about the future about a year down the road with fairly good accuracy. 3 years is a bit dodgy, and by the time you get to 5 years or more, I think you're shooting in the wind. So we've got to be very careful how we predict the future. I think it's more important that we anticipate the future rather than predict it. And that way I think we'll be more ready for the world of technology as it hits us with increasing ferocity. It's going to get faster and faster. Ray Kurzweil, I think he's Google chief architect, or he was until recently. I think he's still there. He's spoken at Learning Technologies in London. very interesting guy. He's got some interesting ideas about the future. Some of them I don't agree with and profoundly disagree with, in fact. But he said one thing that I do agree with, and that is the future and change is exponential now. It's no longer linear. It's going up in a J-curve. And that means that it'll influence and affect everything, every aspect of our lives. Here's someone else predicting the future. Oh, this was great. That's 2 years before the man became president. I'm thinking, you know, actually, that's quite prescient, but I'm also thinking at the same time maybe Homer could have done a better job. But well, it's just a throwaway one. But here's another one. This is an interesting one. Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, said one day every town in America will have one of those, and he was right. Who's been to America? Anyone? You've been to America? You said, yeah, Peter Handelman said you know. But you've been to America. So are there telephones in every town in America? There are. There are, yeah, of course there are. He was right in one way, but he was so wrong in another way, because there are things you cannot predict, like miniaturization and satellite systems and all sorts of new developments which have made it available to everyone to hold in their pocket. And not only is it a phone now, it's all sorts of other stuff as well, isn't it? So he was right in one way, but we're very, very, it's very difficult for us when we're looking down a narrow corridor of our own opinions. And we're trying to predict the future, and we're not seeing the wider issues that are going to be impacting upon us. So this, for instance, the first mobile phones, they were huge. They were mainly battery. And battery is always a problem. So what you see now in shopping malls and in hotels and in airports and so on, you're seeing these things appearing. This was taken a couple of years ago in a shopping mall near the Olympic Park, Stratford in London. And it's quite simple. You've seen these before. Who's used one of these? Anyone? Some of you know. It's what you do is you simply find one with a key in it, and you open it up and you plug your phone in. You take the key and walk away. You come back in 3 hours, 2 hours, whatever it is, after you've done your shopping, and your phone's charged up again. It kind of solves a battery problem that we've got at the moment. But I think increasingly battery life is going to improve with the new technologies. Who's actually got a new Samsung or a new iPhone? Which would you prefer, Samsung or iPhone? Samsung, because it's got a better battery life. Yeah, exactly. I mean, these are issues that we hadn't really anticipated. So when you're trying to predict the future, these are issues, little niggly issues, which sometimes come in the way, and it kind of changes the way you use your technology. Now, here's a picture of someone trying to predict the future in 1910. They were asked to produce a whole load of illustrations to illustrate what would happen in the year 2000. And this is Villemar, the French artist, his impression of what would happen in the year 2000 in teaching and learning. What do you think about that? It's interesting, isn't it? You can see what he's done. It's almost like a metaphor for knowledge transfer. There's actually, we can laugh at it, but there's actually one thing that he has kind of got right. If you look at those students there, those learners, they have these wired transmission receivers. They're listening in an audio culture. You see people on trains and planes and in public places now with their earbuds in and maybe their headphones if they're really trendy. And the thing is, if you can send digital information in one direction, you can send it in the other direction as well. So in effect, what he's designed there is a networked learning community. So in one way, that's quite good. In another way, it's laughable. So when we predict the future, it's very difficult. This one here is a good one. Do you like this one? This is television goggles, and there's the inventor. He's obviously enjoying himself there. I don't know whether it works or not, but that was back in 1963. And another one here. This is a little bit more realistic, apart from the flying car in the background. What you've got here is, in effect, somebody predicting in 1930 that we would one day be able to connect with each other using telephones in a visual way. So think FaceTime, think video conferencing in a handset. So sometimes you can get it right, even though it looks rather retro now and a bit kind of Bakelite. Interesting. So here's the context of what we're going to be doing today. What we've got is what we call digital birth. And there's various commentaries on this, and this is the best picture I can find, actually. Somebody predicted that the average digital birth of children today is 6 months. In other words, they appear on the web around about 6 months. I dispute that. I get pictures like this all the time coming through on Facebook. You know, the ultrasounds of unborn babies. You know, my cousin saying, oh, it's going to be a girl. And the thing is, what we're doing here is we are literally immersing our children in technology even before they're born. So when they emerge into the world, they are emerging into a world that's rich with technology, and they are going to be expecting different things than I think what we offer them in the workplace. Did you realize that the young people leaving school this year around the world have no memory of the last century? Which, by the way, is the century you were born in and probably educated in. Does that make you feel old? We're already nearly 18 years into the 21st century. These are 21st century learners, and they will be 21st century workers. They will work and learn in a different way to the way that you're used to. That's a stark warning for all of us to think about. How are we going to cope with that? How is your organization going to prepare for these new learners as they come in? We're going to talk about what they learn and how they learn in a moment. But it's something for you to think about right now. And this is an old one. Some of you have seen this joke before. This has been going around 4 years, but can you imagine if you showed an 18-year-old one of these? Who actually used one of these? Do you remember these? Who actually used one? Put your hand up if you used one of these. 1.44 megabytes, weren't they? Hardly enough now to store one, image from a phone. But in them days, that was the technology. If you imagine it, if you showed that to an 18-year-old now, they'd probably say something like, wow, you just 3D printed the save icon. Wouldn't they? Now, I'm showing this not just because it's a throwaway joke, but because also it's quite a profound idea, actually, that young people, with the limited life experience they've got, they see things in a different way to older people. I was on a train recently, coming back from London to my hometown of Plymouth, and I was on this train and I was listening to a conversation of two little boys sat across the aisle from me, and they were both schoolboys. You can see they had school uniforms on. They were coming back from school, and one was talking to the other one about a television program that they'd seen. Do you get Sherlock? Do you know Sherlock? You know, Benedict Cumberbatch, Martin Freeman. They were talking about Sherlock on television, and one was saying, wow, it's a really good program, I really enjoy it, it's such fun to watch, and Benedict and Martin, they're such great actors. And the other one stroked his chin sagely, and he was about 9 years old, and he said, yes, it's a good program, but I prefer the classic Sherlock Holmes, the one with Robert Downey Jr. I thought, bingo, that's just nailed it, because that is exactly what we're talking about here. We're talking about narrow frames of reference. We're talking about generational differences in terms of the way you perceive things, the way you use technologies, and the way you appropriate them for your own learning. There are lots of different ways to use a phone. My phone's down there at the moment. But we still call it a phone, but it's got so many different devices in it. It's got, cameras in it now. It's got at least 2 in mine. It's got, obviously, internet and email. You can connect with people. You can use it for social media. You can use it as an accelerometer. You can use it as a GPS. There's so many things that you can do with it. Now, my daughter, who's 25, she understands that. But my father, who's 89, he's got a mobile phone, and he uses it as a phone. It's called a phone, so he uses it as a phone. And there's me. I'm brilliant at using mobile phones. Smartphones. I'm great because I can do a text. With my finger. It takes me a while, but I can do a text. My daughter, she's using her thumb, and she's not even looking. Big difference, isn't it, in the way we appropriate technologies? Different generations. This is a really interesting infographic that I want to show you. If you were to stop the internet for just 60 seconds, what would you miss? Here's some of the stuff you would miss. And I see you all putting your cameras up now and taking pictures and making notes. Let me just go through some of the stuff that we would miss. So, my eyesight's fading, but 70,000 hours of Netflix watched. Do you remember Blockbuster? The video hire company. They had a chance many years ago to buy Netflix, and they said, no, there's no future in it. It's like the man who turned down the Beatles, isn't it? Sometimes these opportunities are thrown up to you, but, you miss it. And so Netflix is now the go-to video channel, isn't it? Google, 3.5 million search queries every minute. on Google. No wonder Larry Page and Sergey Brin are actually laughing all the time. It's, you know, what about this one over here? Like, it doesn't actually say here, but 4.1 million videos watched on YouTube, but 400 hours every minute loaded up. Most of it's rubbish, but sometimes you'll find some real gems in there. And a really interesting one down at the bottom here, nearly a million swipes on Tinder. And it doesn't say whether they're left or right, but it's nevertheless, it shows you what people are doing with technology today. It shows you that we are an online culture. It shows you that we're appropriating these kind of tools for many, many different things, not just entertainment, but information and learning. And we have to be aware that there's a huge digital divide as well, of course, because you know, in certain countries in the world, people don't have the ability to do all this. So there's a big digital divide going on. But having acknowledged that, we can see that this kind of thing is happening in increasing regularity. If I showed you the 2018 version next year, those figures will have risen. And there'll be new tools on there as well we haven't thought of yet. So, let me talk about the future. Here's the acronym that you should remember, because I think that there are 5 key areas. I'm not going to touch on all of them, but there are 5 key areas that we need to watch for the future of humanity. The first one is genetics. I'm not going to touch on that. It's outside my remit. But the second one, robotics. We might talk about that one in a moment. The third one, artificial intelligence, we're definitely going to talk about because that's going to be a very big, I suppose, influence on what we do in the future. Informatics is also going to be big. I separate the two out slightly because there are versions of informatics which are not AI, but which will nevertheless have a huge impact on us. And finally, nanotechnology. And I'm not going to talk about that either, other than to talk about maybe some body modding later on, some body hacking ideas. So those are the 5 key areas, I think, that we're going to be looking at for the future of humanity. And my predictions, I'm going to make several predictions based on what I know and what I'm seeing happening with the trends. And then you can see whether I'm right or not, and whether you agree with me or not. But I think that if we look back at the past, we look at the last, I suppose 30 years. Back in '89, we would have all agreed that multimedia was the future, wouldn't we? So video, you know, computer-assisted learning, mixing up text and images and sounds and videos and so on. That was the future in the 80s. In the 90s, when I spoke at a conference called Online Educa Berlin, they asked me in a question time, what do you think the future is going to be? And in '99, I could see easily what the future was going to be. I said, everything is going to converge on the web. We're going to have internet everything. And that was a no-brainer. It wasn't hard to predict that because it was already happening to a certain extent. But then at Learning Technologies in London, 10 years later, somebody asked me, I think it might have been Don actually, he said, what's the future then? And I said, I think the future is going to be smart mobile. And that seems to be the way things are going. But I'm going to leave my prediction to 2 years down the road until right at the end. Keep you in suspense. Is that all right with you, Go? Keep you in suspense, all right? Yeah? Yeah. Thumbs up. Yeah, okay. So, here are 3 things that I think are going to be huge trends in the future. And I was very gratified to hear you mention those in the earlier discussion with Don. So, the future of learning and development is going to be richly social. It's going to be intensely personal. And it's going to be increasingly connected. Again, those aren't difficult to predict. We can see it happening now, but I see that accelerating in the next few years. So, for instance, here's some of my students taking notes. They're using all 3 of those because they're in a social grouping, they're creating personal memories, and they're also using mobile technologies to connect with each other. And some of my colleagues at Plymouth University would say, well, that's not learning. And I'd say, no, but it's the start, it's the gateway to learning, because what happens next is important. What do they do with those images next? What will you do with your images next? Well, what you'll do is you'll probably look at them and reflect on them, maybe write a blog post around them, maybe modify them, maybe share them, repurpose them in some way. There's a whole range of things you can do with information when you get hold of it. And that's where the learning starts, because that's where you're able to reflect on things. It's where you're able to think critically about what you've learned. It's where you're able to share your knowledge and build on it by investigating further and drilling down through hyperlinks and so on. There's a whole range of stuff you can do once you've got an artifact. It's all about learning through making and learning through involvement with that artifact. So learners, I would say to you, are now not just consumers of content anymore, they're prosumers. They produce as well as consume. So you need to understand, if you don't already, that the learners that you work with, the employees that you work with, they will be creating content and repurposing content and sharing content as well as consuming it. That's a major trend that's been going on for some time now, and we can't deny that it's happening with increasing regularity, because we now have the tools to be able to do that. And the first of the big trends that we've seen recently, I was involved in the first one back in around about 2004, is what we now call massive open online courses. But there's a lot more to them than this. I mean, the history's been rather checkered. I think in some ways, the MOOC started out as a very, very interesting idea with a lot of democratization of participation and knowledge and information and so on. But very quickly, they were appropriated by the large companies who turned them into basically massive online courses, which weren't open anymore. So they became MOOCs, if you like, or I call it a mockery of what the MOOC originally was intended to be. And I say this advisedly, but you know, when you look at what the big companies did to the MOOCs, the C MOOCs became X MOOCs, and the X really was the start of the end for them. But now I see a resurgence, because we talk about micro-learning. I want to talk to you about nanodegrees and micro-accreditation. Because you know as well as I do, if you're an employer, you want well-informed people to be working for you. You want people who are responsive, you want people who are agile, you want people who are creative problem solvers, you want people who are critical thinkers, you want people who are team workers, you want people who can negotiate meaning really well so they can get on with the job and do it to the best of their ability. You want them to be able to find information when they need it very quickly. So the just-in-case curriculum that we used to have is now becoming just in time. But not only just in time, the timeliness of it, it's also becoming just for me, very personal, and just enough. So lots of the online offers now are for skills-based learning. If you want to be a JavaScript developer, or you want to be a full-stack web developer or whatever, you can do micro-accreditation now through large organizations who offer these online programs. And that, I think, is going to be a huge trend, because it will be just for me and just enough. And I see that as something major that's happening. So MOOCs, I think, are having a resurgence, but they'll be a lot smaller. Touch surfaces as well. I mean, we use these all the time now, but I mean, there's so many things that we can do with touch surfaces. I think the important thing to remember here is that younger people were brought up with this, and they know that this is probably the most important way for them to interact with technology. It's tactile, it's haptic, it's got your response, it's got immediacy to it. When you do something, something happens immediately. You don't have to worry about a mouse or a keyboard. It's all contained within one device. And I think that's been a major trend that's been happening over the past, 10 years at least, where we're seeing smartphones now and tablets of various sizes all emerging as the tool to go to, the mobile, personal, social tool. Enough of that. I'm going to talk about wearables just very briefly. Dave Kelly talked about this yesterday, the idea of, that was Google Glass, of course. But there are lots of other versions of this. And I think we're going to see wearables coming back again. Maybe not looking like this, perhaps, but looking a little bit more kind of aesthetic, perhaps. Who's actually seen Snapchat glasses? Anyone seen them? Have you used them? Yeah? Snapchat glasses, for those who don't know, it's a very trendy, I suppose, set of glasses. I think Ray-Ban actually designed them, is that right? Was it Ray-Ban? But one of the major designer companies designed these things, and you can wear them really unobtrusively, and inside them they've got a little camera. And when you want to take a picture, you just take it and it sends it immediately to Snapchat. Now, that's got the same issues, if you like, ethical issues as this. I mean, if you walked into a men's toilets or women's toilets with one of those on, and the same with Snapchat, I think we'll have to start thinking about new legislation for privacy and so on to actually overcome these kind of issues. But I think the point is that this kind of augmented reality that we're looking at here, and the idea of capturing images with the glasses I just mentioned to you, I think these are tools that we've yet to find really big uses for. I mean, there are some uses already in large organizations, but I think the idea of visualizing things and imposing new information onto the real world is going to be hugely important in the future. So wearable technologies. And I won't go into the full range of them, but you know, there are many of these technologies. Here's one that I think that you'll be interested in. Has anyone heard of this one? Waverley Laboratories, the pilot. It's being released this week. I haven't seen it and I haven't tried it, but it's on sale for $249 US right now, and you can stake your claim online. And the idea behind this tool is that you wear it unobtrusively in your ear, well, as unobtrusively as you can with a bright red device, but you wear it in your ear, and if someone is speaking to you in a language you don't understand, it will translate that language into your language instantly for you. Now, as I say, take this with caution because I haven't seen this being used yet. And has anyone actually seen it being used? Anyone tried it out? No. So we don't know how good this is. But if it's as good as they claim it's going to be, I think it could be a game changer. I'm sure some of you are nodding and saying, yeah, you think it might be as well. Obviously, the person who you're speaking to, if you can't speak French, but they're speaking to you in French, then you can listen to them in English, but without being able to speak back into French, I think the conversation could be limited, unless the other person's got an earpiece as well. Now, I know that it translates from French into English. I'm not sure what other languages it does, but have a look at Waverley Laboratories and the pilot and see what it can do for you. So that's coming out in the next few weeks. Here's another interesting one, the idea of social presence, the idea of digital presence through, in this case, an iPad on wheels. This is Edward Snowden speaking at a conference recently. You know, he's incarcerated. He's confined to Russia. He's on the run from the US authorities, but he does keynote presentations through this device. It's rather spooky because I was talking to some friends once at a conference, and I suddenly sensed something behind me, and I turned to look, and there was a guy looking at me through an iPad on one of those platforms, and it was moving around on its own, and I thought, you know, I thought the end had come, you know. I jumped out of my skin, but the thing is, they are spookily, uncannily kind of present when you talk to someone through one of those tools, because they can move around remotely. And it's as if you're talking to the person, even though it's just a head and shoulders. So I'm wondering if you can start thinking about how this might be used in your place of work, if there was any use for that kind of tool. So think about the presence systems that are available now. I'm running through these fairly rapidly. Immersives is the next one. We talk about virtual reality. We talk about the idea about immersing yourself in a simulation, and wherever you look, it follows you around so that you feel as if you're in a different place. We've been experimenting with this at Plymouth for many years, and we've got whole room-based systems as well, hollow systems, if you like, where you can actually go into places where you would never physically or realistically be able to go into. Like, for instance, you could be a blood corpuscle running through the body, through the circulation system, and you see all the heart's chambers rushing past you as you go through it. Or you could travel to the dark side of Saturn or whatever. And zoom out of the universe at light speed. These things are possible with this kind of tool. But we have to ask ourselves, at the moment, yes, it's still quite expensive. There are safety issues with it, which you don't get with augmented reality. With augmented reality, you can look out into the world about you. With immersives, you can't. So you have to be in a fairly safe environment to be able to use it. But there are interesting ideas around how this can be used to allow us to manipulate things and to learn new skills and new knowledge. So look out for immersives. 3D printers is another one we've already got with us. These are nothing new, but they are developing at a pace. The first 3D printers that I saw, the device itself, you had to have a bed of powder in which the artifact was created. And now you can print whole buildings out of liquid concrete using them. You can actually, I heard of someone the other day actually making a whole helicopter in parts from a 3D printed kit. Now, I don't think I'd fly in that, but you can see where it's going, can't you? So as far as additive manufacturing is concerned, this is quite an astounding achievement. It really is Star Trek, isn't it? You know, Earl Grey hot, you know? That will come next. I think they're starting to print foodstuffs already. So this will revolutionize lots of industries, but how could we learn that for using? Well, there's a couple of ideas. There's a few classroom ideas here from schools that I could offer you. And what I'll do is I'll leave these slides somewhere so that maybe we can share them. Is that right, Don? So you can look at these in much more detail later on and have a look at some of the ways that people have been appropriating this tool already. Moving on quickly, gestural computing is an interesting one. We've already got versions of this available. I was invited onto a television program about 5 years ago when a school in my region bought an iPad for every one of its children in the school. I think there were something like 900 iPads that they bought with their school budget. And the parents were kind of getting upset about it because they were wondering about their house insurance and children bringing home this device to the home and getting stolen or broken. And the Taxpayers Alliance were up in arms about it because they were worried about misappropriation of, you know, tax money and so on. And so they called me into the studio, and there I was on BBC television, live, listening to this package from this woman in the studio remotely who was going to be interviewing me. And they played this package of all these people complaining about it, and then the teachers justifying it. And then she came to me and she said, Professor Wheeler, Plymouth University, you're an expert in this field. Is this the future of education? I said, no. I said, it's the present. The future will be when your children sit on your knee and they say, Mum, did you really have to touch a computer to make it work? That's the future. So this Minority Report thing here, you know, Tom Cruise, that's quite accurate. I think we're already able to do things like that. I mean, think of Xbox 360 Connect. You know, think about Nintendo Wii, and think about all these ways that we can manipulate things remotely without using keyboards and mouse. That is coming. Voice activation, facial recognition, a whole range of things, as you'll see in a moment, I think are going to be increasingly possible. Voice control. Have you ever asked Siri to beatbox? If you haven't, have a go, it's fun. I mean, there's endless things you can do with voice control, but we know that Alexa, and we know that Siri, and we know that Google, all these different tools are available. It's a matter of how do we use these in the workplace to make life better for ourselves? How do we use them for learning? Well, I mean, this is almost like a personal assistant, isn't it now? It's how far we want to push this. Pervasive computing. Here's an interesting one. This is one that I suppose some people would call the Internet of Things. I don't call it that. I call it pervasive computing because if you start creating connections with everything in the room and everything connects to you, then suddenly you're able to control your environment in different ways. Do you know, on my mobile phone down there, on my smartphone, I've actually got something called Hive. Anyone heard of that? It's a home environmental control device. And while I'm here in Singapore, if I really want to be mischievous, I can turn the heating up and down while my wife's in the house. It'll drive her mad. I could just do that if I wanted to right now, but I won't, because I value my safety, all right? And I've got to go home tomorrow. But anyway, so let's look at this place here. This is Stratford Shopping Centre. This is the food hall, okay? So what have we got here? Firstly, we've got a table here, which could be connected to the internet. I know that there are restaurants here in Singapore, I've been to them, where you've got an iPad on the table, and you order your food, and then you pay for it, and it comes. Can you imagine that happening all around the world in restaurants? Now can you imagine it in the workplace? What would you do in the workplace with that kind of idea? Another one here. This is a stroller. This is a push chair with a woman with her baby, and on the heads up in front of her there is a route map to show her where the ramps are. So she doesn't have to push the thing up and down stairs or where the nearest lift is. All right, so it's a navigation tool perhaps. Underneath here, you've got footfall devices. So if you're running a retail business, you want to know how many people walk past your shop every day and how many stop to look in the window. And also, where do they look? What do they gaze at the most? This is big data. I knew I wasn't going to mention it, but this is analytics about how people behave. And if you know how they behave, then you can alter their behavior in certain ways by changing the display or changing the way that people walk past. And finally, one more. Are you late for a meeting? Well, you can say, Siri, put my meeting back an hour. What about if everything at home was connected, like the Hive I mentioned earlier on? What if your lawnmower was connected? So you could say, Siri, mow my lawn. And it's possible. The technology's there right now to do that. So think about those kind of automated processes and how you can control them from your simple smartphone device and what that would mean to you in your business. I'm not giving you all the answers here, I'm just asking you to think. Here's the big one, artificial intelligence. Now, let me tell you a story here. Georgia Tech. Anyone heard of Georgia Tech? Georgia Tech is whoops, moved on one. Georgia Tech is actually a university in America, and there was a guy, one of the professors there, who decided to create a massive open online course. And he recruited 116,000 students. It was a very popular course, as you can imagine. 116,000 students. So what am I going to do, he thought. So he thought, okay, what I'll do is I'll employ 12 teaching assistants. So he employed 12 teaching assistants, and they were there simply to respond to all the emails that would come in from the students. You know, I can't do this, or how do I find this, or, you know, I'm in trouble with, and they would answer all of the questions on his behalf while he got on with the big business of actually teaching. And at the end of the semester, when they'd finished the program, the students voted on who was the best teaching assistant. And they voted on Jill Watson, who was one of the teaching assistants who had actually answered more than 60% of the questions on her own. They were low-level questions, but she'd answered them all really promptly within minutes, and she never seemed to be offline. And they made her the best one. They wanted to give the prize to her. And then it was revealed that she was actually a chatbot. It was an artificial intelligence tool that was designed to pick up on low-level questions and answer them remotely there and then. And that's why it was so good. That's why it was so effective. So you can see that even simple little applications of artificial intelligence can make all the difference when it comes to things like online learning. That's just one example. I'm sure you could think of others. I'm not going to labor the point here because we haven't got much time. I'll move on. But I'll just show you that this graph here from, it's from Forbes, actually shows the investment in AI in businesses over the last few years. And it's growing up, and it's growing, and it's growing. And again, I'll leave that for you for later on to look at the figures in more detail and to scrutinize where that comes from. So we're living in exciting times, but I think the most important thing is immediacy here. The Jill Watson case, my own research shows that students feel really left out of it if you don't respond quickly to them when you're at a distance from them. If you can respond quickly and immediately, then they feel valued, they feel that they're being listened to, and they feel that they are a part of the learning community. The longer you take to answer that question, the more remote they feel from you. So in the case of Jill Watson, that chatbot answered the immediacy question immediately. You see what I did there? Right, okay, so moving on, cognitive systems, the idea of cognitive computing. I won't bore you with the details, but it's really to replicate what we do as human beings. So pattern recognition, natural language programming, processing, these kind of things are possible with cognitive systems. They are different to AI systems. The way I can best describe it to you is if you're a doctor and you're diagnosing a disease, looking at a patient and trying to diagnose what's wrong with them. AI will actually tell you, using all the parameters, what's wrong, and then it will tell you what to do next, how to intervene and how to treat that person. Cognitive systems will give you hints. They will analyze all the different patterns and predict what might be wrong with that person and what you might decide to do. So it gives you more leeway, more latitude to be able to decide as the professional what course of action you should really take. And I think that's the big difference. That's my interpretation of it, and I'm perfectly open to debate on this. But Gerd Leonard, another friend of the conference, said recently something really important, and I agree with him, that there's not a single algorithm that's being created at the moment that can actually replicate fully what a human being does. I wrote about this recently. I wrote about the idea that computers can never replace teachers, and I'll stand by that. There's one simple reason why computers can never replace teachers or instructors or learning development people. It's because Computers can never break rules. We break the rules all the time when we think we need to, when we're intuitive, when we're creatively thinking about something, we will break the rules. Computers cannot do that. Even if you program them to break the rules, it's because you've programmed to do so that they're breaking the rules. So this is why I disagree with Ray Kurzweil's idea that we'll be reaching a singularity in 10 years' time. You know? He's said that for the last 20 years. It'll be in 10 years' time. And it's like a mirage in the distance. As you move towards it, it keeps getting farther away. So I don't think we'll ever get to that point where computers will replace what we do as human beings fully. It will replace the mundane stuff. It will replace the repetitive stuff and the really simple low-level stuff. But the high-level cognitive processing that we have to do, the creative stuff, the intuitive stuff, I don't think we'll ever see anything that will replace us in terms of machine intelligence, and particularly around emotions, our emotional connections to each other, our relationships. These are things that cannot be replicated by algorithms. If you want to disagree with me, that's fine. We can have a good discussion about this. And, this is a really exotic one. We'll get into the exotic now, quantum computing. In normal computing, you've got binary digits, what we call bits. And bits can either have a one or another state. They can either be a 1 or a 0, an on or an off. Okay? But they can't be both. In quantum computing, you can have both. They call them qubits, and essentially there are about 4 or 5 different versions of this available. And quantum computing is supposed to be much faster and slicker and more useful in terms of the multiple tasking that it can do, because the bit can be an on and an off at the same time. And through this weird thing called quantum entanglement, it somehow works. The big problem we've got is trying to reconcile all these systems together, because one is made of light, the other one is made of something else. To try and get them to speak to each other is the big problem at the moment. So that's the big problem that quantum computing scientists are trying to solve. And I'm not sure how they'll do it. Implants. This is getting really scary. Who here is a cyborg? Has anyone actually got a digital implant? It's happening all around the world. You're getting people who are modding their bodies. They're body hacking, as they call it. I'll give you 2 examples, one from a while ago now. This is Kevin Warwick, who's a professor at Reading University. And back around about almost 20 years ago now, he had a little glass tube with a chip inserted into his skin. And that chip was a programmable chip. And what it did was it allowed him to open doors by walking towards them. You know, locked doors would open because they recognized, it was context aware, and it recognized the chip in his hand. He could sit down at his computer, and the computer would turn on without him using a password. And it would say, "Good morning, Professor Warwick. What would you like to do today?" So it made it very personalized for him. Now, we now have to imagine, with the latest technologies, with RFID, radio frequency identity devices, and the context-aware systems that we have available to us, you can imagine various scenarios. So somebody wants to know about a particular item of technology in the room. So they walk up to it. They have their RFID chip inside them. The longer they stand in front of that device, the more information it feeds about itself. And then when they want, they go back to their mobile phone, they go like that, and it's all on the phone for them to keep. No more forgetting passwords, no more forgetting numbers and ideas and so on, because it's all within the chip. Now, there are obviously issues around that, ethical issues and privacy issues and moral issues, but that is what we're looking at now as a possible future, the idea of cybernetic organisms, cyborgs. Here's another one, Tanya Vlach. Anyone heard of her? She tragically lost an eye in an accident about, 15 years ago. And since then, she's become what they call a body artist. She's been crowdfunding a prosthetic eye, which can actually be connected straight into the visual cortex of her brain so she can see again using the eye. But not only that, she's looking at modifying the eye so that it can zoom in to things and see things from the, things like, the infrared spectrum. It's a bit like Geordi LaForge in Star Trek again, isn't it? But that's what she's doing right at the moment. Look up these 2 people. Very interesting characters. And they are just the tip of the iceberg of what we call the body hacking community. And it's growing in numbers. Literally tens of thousands of people now have these chips inserted into them. What does that mean if that happens? Really exotic. This is the Muse headband, which is essentially 4 electroencephalograms that sit on the side of your head. And it learns by your brain waves that you create as you're thinking, and as you're laughing, and as you're, musing about something. That's why it's called the muse. It will actually learn from that, and ultimately they're saying that if you practice with one of these things, it will allow you to reduce stress, but it will allow other things like remote control of devices, just by thinking. That's a very prototype version. And we have to look at the hype system here, this kind of idea about how do these ideas start and where do they go to? Do they actually become something possible, or do they just fade away after a while because people aren't interested or because it's too dangerous? So all of the things I've told you need to think about in terms of the realistic aspect of whether we can actually use them or not, and whether they're ethically and morally and physically safe to actually use. You see, we all want change, but often we don't want to change because it's too much effort. You're right? Yeah? You know what I'm saying? So, if we need to change, then I've been working on this model here, which borrows from the work of Clayton Christensen. So you've got, on the bottom axis, so you've got impetus of change, and on the left-hand side, you've got the degree of discomfort within the organization. And inertia is where we have no change. It's where you're doing the same things over and over again in the organization, and you're getting the same results. And I think Einstein once said, madness, the first sign of madness is doing the same thing over and over again and trying to get different results, which isn't going to happen because you're in inertia. Nothing's moving. If you want to move up and actually do something positive to change things, you need to go to iteration. And this is where you change certain things that improve the actions. Okay? To go even farther up from that into the discomfort zone, but to create more change, you need to go to what we call innovation, which is where you start changing things that create major changes in your organization. But here's the real kicker. This is the one that people hate. They don't like the idea, they don't like the word, and they don't like the discomfort that it creates. This is where we get to disruption, where you're actually doing things so new and so different and opening up such new markets that you really don't ever want to go back to the way you were before. There's a bit of an event horizon there, at the point of no return. And once you're over it, and you are in a sustainable type of disruption, it changes forever the way we operate. Now here's the big danger. This isn't on the diagram, but I could easily put another arrow, because if you over-disrupt what you're doing, you get to the point where you go back to inertia again. You fall back to inertia, because people see that it's been a really bad experience and they don't want to change anymore. So you've got to be careful when you disrupt at that level, and it's very rare that this happens. We've seen it happen a few times recently with technology, but if you are into that idea where you want to disrupt to the point where you're opening up new markets and doing new things in different ways, be careful that you find a way to sustain it. Otherwise you could, as I say, slip right back into inertia. And I'm still working on that model. We'll be producing a book next year around about digital leadership, and that will be one of the chapters in it. So I'm moving on again, and I just want to quote Eric Shunning here. Some of you may know him. If we don't build change into learning, all technology will do is compound the failure, which is exactly what I've said. We've got to build change into the learning. We've got to build change into the way we use our technologies. We've got to future-proof what we do as organizations. Otherwise, we are sunk, and some other competitor will take over. Remember 1982, all these things happening? I just want to go back in time a bit briefly here. This is when personalization started, when the first little tools came out, which were no longer teacher-centered. They were learner-centered. People could take them away and use them, microcomputers. And then we got into the point where, around about 1990, the World Wide Web was established. Tim Berners-Lee said, this is for everyone. This is him at the 2012 Olympic Games opening ceremony. And that was the turning point, I think, where everything became personalized and when we started to become social. And then these tools started to arrive around about 2010. Remember the first iPhone? I have one at home and it still works. I was one of the first to get one. And all these other tools. Till we get to the point where we're starting to immerse ourselves in these tools and technologies. Here are the trends. We're going from instructor-led to learner-led. That's the first one you need to look out for. I've told you all about the technologies that are emerging, but here are the trends. These are the mega trends, if you like. The second one is that we are going towards more discursive content. Look at this. From recursive to discursive. That's the Mandelbrot set. It's a fractal. It repeats and repeats and repeats and repeats. If all we're going to do in organizations is to repeat the learning that we've got in our heads without our learners going away and learning something new about what it means to their context, then we are sunk again. That will be inertia. To move out of that inertia into iteration and transformation, we've got to be more discursive. We've got to allow our learners to have some latitude to go out and learn new things, to be able to do their own personal research. And I'll give you an example of how that doesn't work. Here's somebody explaining to a student an equation. And they want to know if the student understands that equation, the way it's done. And so they give them another one, and here's the result. I'll let it sink in. Can you see what's happened? This is surface learning. This is learning that is not iterative. It's learning that is not discursive. It's just repetitive learning, and it's rote learning based on what you think you know. There's no depth of understanding there. There's no wisdom coming out from that. I was working, this is a true story, last week I was at Auckland University of Technology, down in New Zealand, and I was working with a group of medics down there, and they're training people to go into the health professions, across 15 different professions, physiotherapists, pharmacists, nurses, doctors, the lot. And they have to teach this module. It's a 12-week module on anatomy and physiology of the body, the human body, right? And they said to me, Steve, can you help us? Our students aren't engaged. Our students aren't learning in a deep way. They're just coming in when they want to, and they're reading stuff, and they're not really doing anything, but they're not really learning deeply, and we're really concerned that they're not engaged. What can you do to help us? I said, go discursive. They said, what do you mean? I said, well, ask them ungoogleable questions. And they said, is that a word? I said, it is now. Ungoogleable. And they said, what do you mean? Everything's Googleable. I said, is it? I said, if I can ask you a question about anatomy and physiology, you being the experts, you being worldwide experts here, you are worldwide experts in anatomy and physiology. If I can ask you a question and you don't know the answer to it, and you can't Google it, what will you do? I said, wow, you know. I said, here's a question for you then. What is there exactly 5 of in the human body? And they went, ooh, senses. I said, no, there's 33 if you look it up. There's 33 different senses that have been identified. So what is there exactly 5 of in the human body? And they've started to get embarrassed because these are doctors. And one of them said, digits on the hand. I said, no, you've got 10. In fact, you've got 20 if you count your toes. And they were really stumped by this. They couldn't think what there was exactly 5 of in the body. And in the end, they tried to Google it and they couldn't. And so I said, that's an ungoogleable question. It makes you think hard. It makes you worry to the point where you have to go away and research it deeply to learn it. And the answer is, shall I tell you? Lobes of the lung. We've got 5 lobes, 3 on one side, 2 on the other. And they went, oh, of course it is. And they were kicking themselves. Of course it is. I said, but that's just the gateway. I said, then you ask the students next, you ask the learners next, why are there 3 lobes on one side and 2 on the other? Oh, that's because the heart's slightly inclined to the left. Why is it inclined? And you keep asking the why questions, and they become more and more deeply engaged. And I put it to you that this is exactly the kind of thing we need in our organizations. We need to start, if we're training people to work at a high level in our organizations, we need to ask the ungoogleable questions. And it's up to you as the expert in the domain that you're working in to find what those ungoogleable questions are and then pose them to your students to get that total engagement that we need. This is what we're talking about here. We're going from analog to digital as well. That's another phase that's happening. It's virtually done, actually. This is a trend that's happened already. Another thing we're doing is going from closed to open in many ways. And I don't know whether your organization practices open learning, but you need to look it up to see what the benefits are as well as what the limitations might be. What would it mean if you actually adopted that approach? I'm rushing through these here. Tethered to mobile. You know what's coming next? I took this picture because I saw what was going to happen. I took this picture on a Monday morning, and by Wednesday, that had happened. And I'm glad I got the picture of it. Because, you see, we're moving from tethered to mobile in many ways. Lots of organizations now, particularly in schools and universities, they are ripping out the computer suites. They are tearing out the computer suites and using the rooms for other purposes. I think the same thing is happening to training rooms as well in many organizations. But the idea behind this is that you should not be showing people or sending them a message that this is where computing is done in this room. Because clearly it's done everywhere now. And people bring in their own devices anyway. Unless it's a specific reason, we need to move towards untethered, I think, in many ways, mobile. I'm nearly finished now. I want to tell you another story here about, as an example of personalized learning. There was an architect who was, he was tasked to design a new university campus. So he designed this campus, and he designed it in a very clever way, and they accepted his design, and he was commissioned to build it, and they built it. And as they were topping out the buildings, the organizers came to him and they said, the students and the staff are going to be arriving in a few weeks. So where are the pathways? And he said, wait. They said, what do you mean? Wait, the students and the staff are arriving. They'll be walking across the grass. He said, well, wait. Okay, they said, you're the boss. And so they waited. And the students and the staff came along. And they started moving across between the buildings, across the grass. And they created these pathways. And when the pathways were well defined, he came in and paved them over. What you've got, you see here, is the distance between user experience and design. You've got this, what we call desire lines. And what I'm trying to say to you here is that in our organizations, you've got lots of people who are learning all the time. Your job should not be to say, this is the way you're going to learn, or this is the pathway you're going to walk down. Your job is to say to them, look, if that's the way you're learning, I will try to support you with that. That, for me, is the ultimate future for learning and development, that you support your learners in any way that you can to get them to the point where they need to be, using the tools that they want to use. It's a big, tall order, but I think it's got to be done. So we're going from standardized to personalized in a very big way. Look out for that trend. And so we're looking at, how do we join the dots? How do learners join the dots? And they join them in lots of different ways. And I think there's a point where you've got to stop allowing them to join them in different ways, because you could end up in madness. So there is a caveat to that. Help them as much as you can, but don't help them to the detriment of the company. We talk about learning in many different ways. This is Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, where you've got what you can learn on your own against what you can learn with the help of other people who are more knowledgeable others. Okay? But increasingly what we're looking at here is that digital scaffolding is available through technologies and tools. So I'll give you the example of this gentleman here, who is a Kenyan athlete who in the Rio Olympics won the gold medal in the javelin. He threw the farthest in the competition and won the gold medal. How did he learn to be so good? Anyone want to guess? Shout it out. Digitally scaffolded through YouTube. He didn't have a coach. He learned by watching the champions like Jan Zelezny and Steve Backley and all the champion javelin. He watched their techniques and he copied them. And he won the javelin without a coach. Look up the story. His name is Julius Jago. It's a wonderful story. This is autodidactism. This is teaching yourself. So we learn by doing, but we learn by failure as well. There's a lot of things that we could talk about here. We're talking about going from isolated to connected. It's another trend. So if you can imagine that this person on the left down here by the table is connected to 3 other people. That's not a lot, but each of those maybe is connected to a larger network until you get to the point where you're involved in a very exponential network. If I put a tweet out and someone like Stephen Fry, who I did prove to someone the other day actually does follow me on Twitter. Was it you, Helen? Stephen Fry actually does follow me. And if he retweets what I've just said, it's going to go out to 20 million people within seconds. This is the exponential social network. This is the power of being connected. So we've got to allow our learners to be connected in as many different ways as possible. Running out of time, Don? I'll stop in a minute. Just a few more ideas for you. Blimage was something where we got people to learn by making. We got them to learn by sharing images with each other and challenging each other. Was anyone involved in this? Did anyone take part? I know you did. All around the world, something like 500 educators and learning and development people took part in this by challenging each other, by sending each other images and then blogging about what it meant for their learning. And they came back to me and they were saying, this is really creative stuff because it's made me think hard about who I am as a professional and what it means for me to learn using my technologies. So that was just one of the many things that you can do using these connected tools. Learning by making has all of these tools and characteristics within it. I'm going to rush through these towards the end because I just want to talk to you about what we see as the future learning topologies here. This is an architecture based upon interaction tools, interface, and infrastructure, where we have cloud-based quantum computing at the top. This is, I see as the future. But right at the bottom, the really important one is where you are using your personal learning network to collaboratively filter, intelligent filtering, if you like, and curation of ideas. And that's just one version. Alvin Toffler said the 21st century learner will not only learn, but they will unlearn and relearn as well. And our new learners, this is the important bit, our new learners have all these characteristics. The most important one is their own nodes of production. I think Helen said earlier on about you are your own learning platform. And I think it's coming true. And I show my learners this. I say to my students, what's wrong with this? And I swear, the other day one of them said, is it 70%? I swear that's true. And I said, look at it again. And she went, oh, I see what you've done there. We need digital literacies. We need digital wisdom. We need the ability to be able to discern what's good and bad out there, no matter what technology we're using. This, to me, is part of our future. So we start off with skills, and then we become competent. But if we start then using our skills in an alien environment, we have to learn the literacies of how to relearn what we've learned to practice in a new environment. And eventually we might reach fluency. Yeah, I'll let you take a photograph of that as well. But the whole point about this is that skills are not enough anymore. When you were at school, you learned to read and write, and you learned mathematics, and you learned to speak and listen. These are good skills, and you're not going to replace them, but you do have to enhance them now because of the ways that we're using technology. So here's 9 of the new literacies that I've identified. The top level is social dimension, the right level is personal dimension, and the left level is knowledge management. But the one that's the really important one is the one right in the middle, transliteracy. And I'll just explain to you briefly before I close what transliteracy is, so you can see how this works. Transliteracy is the ability to be able to communicate yourself equally well across any platform you choose to use. Whatever it is, whether it's face-to-face, remote, Facebook, texting, YouTube, whatever, you should be able to develop your literacies to such an extent that you are a powerful communicator across those tools. So that's the really important one. And Federman's 4 C's. How to connect, how to make context, how to interpret complexity, and how to make meaning. These are the big tools. And one final slide for you to think about. Here's how I see it going. Bottom, you've got degree of social connectivity, and on the top, on the left side, you've got the degree of information connectivity. And we started off with what we would now call, I suppose, Web 1. And these are false distinctions, I know, but bear with me. This would have been the web, okay? The early web from the 90s onwards. And then around about the turn of the century, maybe 2004, we started to see the social tools, the social web being emerged. What we called the social web, or Web 2.0. There is something which is a lot more information-driven than that, but it's less social, and that's the semantic web, which some people call Web 3.0. But ultimately, the meta web is where we're heading, because that's the trajectory where we want social richness and information richness. So Web 1 was all about connecting information. Web 2 was about connecting people. Web 3 was connecting knowledge, and the X web, or the smart extended web, is where you connect intelligence. And that, folks, is where we have to head to. So I said I'd give you one final prediction. I think by about the next 2 years, we're going to be looking at pervasive technology where everyone is connecting to everyone else and everything. And as Ray Kurzweil says, it's exponential. So one final thought from John Dewey about comfort zones and about change. And hopefully that's it. And thank you for listening.